All right, all. Today we're going to talk about methods. So, a method is a way to encapsulate a little bit of code that we're going to reuse a bunch of time that's going to do some kind of action or calculation for us. So, let me let me highlight a couple of things here. So, let's just start with the absolute dead simplest thing I can think of, which is that I'm going to make in here a public static uh, int method called add that's going to take two integers. So I'm going to call it integers that we're going to take an integer a and an integer b. Okay. And my goal is to add those two numbers together and then give it back. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to say we're going to return, and the thing we're going to return is a plus b. And now let's test that out. So let's modify our little print line there. And let's just go ahead and run this and see what happens. So you might be expecting it to say something about A and B, but it didn't. And the reason it didn't is that A and B don't really exist yet. I haven't called this method. And so nothing's ever being used there. So let me call the method. So I'll show you how to call it. You just type the name of the method and then in parentheses and the numbers you want to call it on and a semicolon. And now that's going to call add. Now I want to do something with that. So I'm going to call that, I'm going to make a variable, I'm going to make an integer variable called sum that's the result of adding, and then we'll throw a quick print here, and we'll print out that sum. So now we should see, here we should see a 5. There we get a 5. Cool. So let's talk a little bit about what the structure of a method is. So the first thing here, this public thing, is called an access modifier. I'll have another video just shortly about how access modifiers work, but that's an access modifier. Static is what's called an optional modifier. Again, there will be another video later in the series about what that means. Don't worry about it for right now. Then there's a return type. So the return type in this case is integer. That's saying that when this method is complete, it's going to give me back an integer. Then we've got one more thing here, or two more things. So the next thing is the method name. That's really what I'm going to call it. So that's the add here, right? So that's how do you call this thing later. And then in the parentheses, we have what are called parameters. And parameters are the things that you're passing to the function. You're going to notice that this thing here that I just wrote feels a lot like this thing here. This might clue you into void. Void is actually a return type. And void really just means that it doesn't return anything. So we're not expecting anything back from a void method. Okay, let's write ourselves a couple more examples. Let's write one that doesn't return anything, that just does something. So that's going to be a public static void method that I'm going to call print name. And print name is going to expect a string, and I'm just going to call that string name. Notice you kind of get to pick what your parameters are called. They don't have to be called the same thing. That, like, if you're passing a variable to a method, it doesn't have to have the same name as the variable that you're passing to it. This is going to be very happy to get a dummy name. There's a little weirdness with overlapping names anyways. Again, that'll be another video about scope if you want to go look for that one. All right, for right now, I just want to have this print out the name. Oops, I can spell, I promise. So we're going to do system out print line, and we're just going to put the name in here, and that's going to go ahead and print out whatever the variable we pass to it is. So let's just say, actually, yeah, that'll be fine. Okay, so let's call print name on my name, and we'll hit run, and we should see Joe shows up here. Okay, so there's another thing we can do here, which is we can do what's called overloading. Java's got this kind of neat feature. This is actually a thing I really like. You can't just use the same name and the same returns, or the same parameters, but you can use the same name in different parameter sets. So I'm going to make another variable here that I'm going to call, number of times. Okay, and what the number of times is going to do is that's going to, my goal is to make a method that either prints your name once if you don't say anything, or if you pass along an integer, it should print your name a bunch of times. So we're going to do for and integer I starting at 0, as long as I is less than the number of times, we'll increment by 1. Great. Okay, so now we should see our once here. So if I run, we're still printing once. Here, if I do 6, so I just added a 6. Now we're printing 6 times. Right now, this doesn't really have any controls on it. So if you put in a, like, say, -2 here, this would do something a bit weird, right? It never printed my name. It never printed my name because I didn't tell it, it didn't print my name because it started this counter at 0, and 0 was already bigger than number of times, so it just stopped. So that's our kind of, this is kind of how you deal with optional arguments. In Python, you'd use like keywords or something. In Java, this method overloading thing is actually really neat. I find this to be quite nice, actually. Okay, other things we should probably talk about for methods. Your methods are all defined in your main class for right now. That'll change later, and that'll change when we talk about public and static, and yeah, it'll change when we talk about access modifiers and when we talk about making our own objects. For right now, I think this is probably good enough to start. So write some methods of your own. Some good example methods are things like converting from Celsius to Fahrenheit. Those are real chill. Maybe taking a string and like removing certain characters from it. So you might like take a string that represents like a sentence and like remove all the space characters from it. That's kind of good practice. You might go through a string and replace certain letters with numbers, like a leet speak converter, or you might go through a string and replace certain letters with emojis, or you might write you could write a sensor function, or you could do some math, right? You could write like a rectangular area function or a circular area function or something like that. So there's a lot of options for things that you can write with functions. Sorry, I keep saying the word functions. The difference between a function and a method. So methods are part of a class. The way Java is structured, everything essentially has to be a method. In some other languages, you can write what looks like a method in Java as a kind of standalone thing that's not part of a class. that is called a function. So a function is a method without a class, and a method is a function in a class. That's really the only distinction. You will 100% hear me screw that up when I'm talking fast or when I'm kind of thinking about something else in the background. It's really easy for me because I kind of learned to write functional programs, so everything was a function when I first started writing code. That's so much not how it is these days. So in Java, everything's a method. In Python, there's both functions and methods. In some other languages, there's only functions, but very few people write in those languages these days because object-oriented programming is such a powerful technique. All right, late addition to the video. I was just commenting this out to put the GitHub repo away for everybody so you could see the code on your own later. And I remembered I really should talk about Javadocs here. So in the grand scheme of commenting, we can comment something like this. This method takes two integers and return their sum. That's a perfectly reasonable and valid way to document things. However, when I hover this, I get this kind of minimalist thing. We can actually do a little better than that. So there's a tool called Javadocs. So I'm going to go ahead and put one above this function here. So the way you make a Javadoc is you start with a slashy, a couple of asterisks. That's going to give us some stuff here. It pre-populated some of this for me. So I'm going to go ahead and just say that this computes the sum of the two supplied numbers. And then I'm going to say parameter A is the first number. Parameter B is the second number. And it returns the sum of A and B. Okay, now the reason for this, like, this doesn't seem any different than what I had before except more steps. The nice thing about this is that hovering now gives me this much nicer HTML formatted summary. We can also say which error types are expected here. We haven't talked about throwing our own errors yet, but when we get there, we'll be able to include which errors you can expect from this function. This is going to mimic actually some of the built-in functions we have. So this is how these kind of nice hoverable tooltips are generated. And it's important for us to be able to generate our own nice tooltips because a lot of the projects you're going to work on in this class specifically are these things that are someplace between a couple hours and a couple days worth of work for a solo developer. That's not really how code actually gets generated. Like, there's very little production code out there that's of that small of a form factor. You can really expect that production code is, at least a week's worth of work for a developer before it like gets shipped or turned into an app or something. And if somebody's going to have to go back later and possibly maintain that code, especially in the possibility that you're going to pass this code off to someone else, that's where you really want these nice documentation tools. That's where you want to have done a good job with documentation. My reasoning for doing this is usually selfish. For me, it's usually that I'm going to be the jerk who's going through my code later, cursing the previous developer, which in my case is usually just past me. And I like to be nice to past me. So I don't want future me to be cursing past me, and as past me, I want future me to have a chill time. So I tend to put in the time and do my documentation when I actually remember and understand what I've built, because I've had far too many experiences of going back into code that I thought I was never going to use again, or never going to have to modify again, and having to change it or having to use it again. And like, it's so frustrating to know that you once knew what was going on and you didn't bother to write it down. So documentation like this makes life really easy for kind of future you who's going to be developing on this later. So with that, I will let you go. Thank you guys for watching. I will catch you on the next one.